Star Trek has made somewhat of a comeback recently with the release of new shows like Star Trek Discovery that go back to the franchise's roots after the adrenaline-filled detour that was the Kelvin timeline. These new shows have had the daunting task of fitting into the accepted canon of Star Trek, which is challenging for Discovery, seeing as it's supposed to be a semi-prequel that takes place in between Enterprise and the original series, but then the original series pilot takes place during Discovery's, or before Discovery's or before the first season. It's weird. This creates a lot of continuity errors, understandably, which is normally an acceptable thing after such a large time gap between like the early 2000s and Enterprise and now with Discovery. But Star Trek has a history with handling continuity errors very well by creating new canon that like goes in between, that bridges the gap. I'll go into examples in a bit, but Discovery doesn't do that, and they kind of just create their own new continuity, and it's really not good, which is why a lot of people have a problem with it. So the first major challenge that Discovery has to overcome to kind of like fit into the timeline is fitting in with like the original series, which kind of has its own established like design aesthetic and stuff. I say aesthetic, it's just visual effects for the like early 60s. Instead of like redesigning that all to try and like fit in with more modern day design and like CGI, Star Trek has just kind of like accepted that that's what stuff looked like during that like time period in like the future. So Star Trek Enterprise looks completely different. It looks like a lot better. Like obviously the CGI is better. It looks a lot different to the NCC 1701, which is the Enterprise in the original series, and that kind of in-universe is just because the NX-01 is more of an experimental ship. They've just built it. It's not designed to be like a nice habitable ship that you live in like constantly. Whereas the NCC 1701 is the 60s kind of bad design. I say bad. It's not that bad. It's pretty bad. It's just kind of accepted as what the Starfleet ships look like because it's more like sleek, and they've got like the technology to just kind of make it look like simple. And so you'd think that because Enterprise goes through the hassle in A Mirror Darkly of making it established that the NX-01 and the Defiant, which is pretty much the sister ship of the Enterprise, looks like the same, and they look the same as they do in their respective shows when they like meet up. You'd think that Discovery would do the same because it's in the same franchise, so they should have the same like method of dealing with this. They don't. They just design the ships to look like something that would exist in any modern sci-fi show. And Discovery is a modern sci-fi show, and it does that very well, but it's less good at being a Star Trek show. So they kind of design their ship. It's more like blocky and less like sleek than like newer ships in Star Trek, which is understandable, but then it also kind of, they just have these weird like holograms that every show seems to have now, where they just like tap this and they do that. And holograms in Star Trek that are kind of introduced in Next Generation and like heavily built upon in Voyager are these lifelike things that can look like anything that you see in front of you. Like there's people that are just holograms and you can like touch them and stuff, but they're not there, they're holograms, they can disappear at the same time. And then Discovery has these holograms that look more similar to just like generic sci-fi holograms, which they then put in Picard as well, which is supposed to take place after Voyager. It's a whole mess. The second thing that they kind of have to deal with, apart from like ship design, is character design. Klingons in the original series look like this. They're just like people with moustaches and slight racial stereotypes. And then in the motion picture, which is the next thing in the timeline after the original series and the animated series, whatever, the comics, the Klingons look like this, and they're old and wrinkly, and that's kind of what they look like in every other show. It's a bit weird how they just kind of go from one to the other, like no explanation, but they give it an explanation. In Enterprise, we see the wrinkly Klingons that at this point we're more used to in a prequel show before the human-y looking Klingons. And the way they explain it is that there's a weird genetically altering virus that's going around at the time of the original series, and a lot of the Klingons have got it because of genetic mutation that the Klingons have been experimenting on. Some of them just look like humans. And then in Deep Space Nine, we get what the original actor that plays one of these human-y Klingons in full old wrinkly Klingon makeup. He kind of looks like this, and that is just explained that he's been like cured of the virus. He doesn't look like it anymore, which is a really good, intuitive way of putting these people into the timeline without completely disregarding it. But then Discovery, they just look like this. For like no reason, they just completely redesign it. They're not like humanoid at all anymore. They're just like weird lizard people. Obviously, it looks more similar to the original, and then they don't have the hair, and they explain the hair, they like get rid of the hair, but it doesn't, and they like dress differently, and it's all weird, and it doesn't make sense, and I hate it. Going back to the ship design, I was talking about the original NCC 1701 compared to the NXI 1, and how they kind of like make it work, that they look different. Well, in Discovery, when they have these all like fancy looking ships that really don't fit into like the design aesthetic of the time, the actual original 1701 Enterprise turns up, and you're going to think, oh wow, maybe they'll do what they did in Enterprise with the ship that looks exactly the same. It's all like, no, they just completely redesigned it to look similar to the ships in Discovery. It's really terrible and lazy, and I hate it. Also, it's really hard to believe that these ships like fit in a timeline together and they just like keep going like that, because the kind of like textures that the ships have in Discovery, they don't really implement until later in like the Next Generation movies, and it just doesn't work at all. And then also in Discovery, they introduce a mode of transportation that completely ruins the warp scale that's been established, and it can just teleport anywhere, whenever. And then, spoiler alert, they kind of cheaply write it out of the show by sending them to the future. And then in the future, they have this weird programmable matter stuff that's supposed to be like, oh, it can do anything. They also already established in Voyager that they have holograms, which are infinitely better than programmable matter and can do like anything. And then they've got like hologram people called like holos, and that's not what they're called in Voyager and stuff. Also in Picard, they use similar ship design to Discovery, which just doesn't make sense, especially on the other. At the end of the day, it doesn't really matter. Discovery is a really good show, and I'd still enjoy watching it. It's just moments where these small like chinks in the continuity that turn up, and like when the Enterprise turned up, I was like, wow, it's the Enterprise. And after that like nostalgia faded, I was like, but that doesn't look like the original Enterprise. Now they're making Strange New Worlds, and that's going to have that Enterprise in it, but then all the uniforms in Strange New Worlds aren't the same ones that would fit into the Discovery kind of uniform thing that are then supposed to go into the thing. They're like new uniforms where they're just actively ruining the continuity to like save money, which is just cheap and terrible, and there's ways they could do it that fit better into the continuity that would be so much easier and simple if they just put someone on the goddamn show that's seen the other things, like they're doing Lower Decks and Prodigy, because that's really... I didn't record an outro, so, hi, sorry I've been gone for 5 months. Bye.